I am no maester to quote history at you, your grace. Swords have been my life, not books, but every child knows that the Targaryens have always danced too close to madness. Your father was not the first. King Jaehaerys once told me, the madness and greatness are two sides of the same coin. Every time a new Targaryen is born, he said, the gods toss a coin in the air and the world holds its breath to see how it will land. Barristan Selmy to Daenerys Targaryen. A Storm of Swords Chapter 71. Daenerys 6. The idea of Targaryen madness is a huge part of the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, given the looming shadow it has on the current events of the main book series, with it becoming synonymous with, well, the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen and the realm-shattering Robert's Rebellion that resulted from his troubled reign. There is a common phrase in Westeros that when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin. One side greatness, the other side madness. It surely exists for a reason. King Jaehaerys II obviously believed it so for a reason. In this video, we aim to do two things. Go through every Targaryen since Aegon's conquest you could argue showed this madness, and decide who of them was truly mad. The other thing this video aims to do is break down the idea as to if House Targaryen really actually deserves this reputation of madness. The answer to this, and some of the inclusions of who could be considered a Mad Targaryen, might surprise you, because at the end of the day, the trouble with this concept of madness really depends on the lens you are viewing it through, and how you are defining the term. From an in-world historical point of view, or from our modern understanding of the idea of madness and mental illness as readers. This video will attempt to look at the concept through both of these lenses to some degree. You are not old enough to have known Aerys Targaryen. Aerys was mad and cruel. No one has ever denied that. He was still king, crowned and anointed, and you had sworn to protect him. I know what I swore. Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth, A Storm of Swords Chapter 11. Jaime 2. I think the best place to start is really with the three arguably most well-known and iconic Mad Targaryens, ones who stand out in the history books and whose actions shaped the world lore and history in huge meaningful ways. The Mad King, Aerys II Targaryen, is the most clear-cut of these Mad Targaryens, ticking the boxes in many different ways. During his youth and early reign, Aerys was a relatively normal king. In fact, when he came to the throne, with a young cohort of councillors with him, there was much hope of a new era of prosperity. In fact, at first under the guiding hand of Tywin Lannister, things did get off to a good start. But as the years passed, Aerys' mood swings became more frequent and his behaviour increasingly erratic. He became more and more jealous and suspicious and violent as the years went on, prone to these furious outbursts, with few able to ever calm him. Aerys was always known to be a ladies' man, and women too seemed to love him. But there was a very sudden shift in his behaviour in 274 AC, when Aerys renounced all women but his wife, following the death of his newborn son. While a healthy son in Viserys was born the following year, this only increased Aerys' obsessive behaviour and fear for the child's life. Up to this point, while it was well known at court that the king's mood could change like the wind, as he did have anger issues, these issues were kept in check for the most part thanks to men like Tywin Lannister. Him doing a good job as hand meant these issues didn't really impact his wider rule or reputation at this stage. This kind of behaviour does not earn you the title of the Mad King. But after the defiance of Duskendale, in which King Aerys was held captive by the rebellious Darklings of Duskendale, these characteristics became more pronounced. We cannot be certain what exactly happened to Aerys during his months of captivity. Some suggest he was beaten and tortured. Others that much more sinister things occurred. But whatever did happen inside the Dunfort fundamentally changed Aerys Targaryen. It was a before and after point. Aerys began to see every unexplained event as an act of minor defiance, as evidence of fearful conspiracies against him. and devised sadistic punishments for those he imagined to be his enemies. He developed a fascination with fire, which eventually grew so consuming he could only become sexually aroused by watching someone burn to death. His marriage to his sister wife Rhaegal was never a happy one, and Aerys became abusive later in his reign. According to Maester Yandel, Aerys would go from mirth to melancholy in the blink of an eye by the year 281 AC, including spells of hysterical laughter, long silences, bouts of weeping, and sudden rages. The king also became more and more obsessed with dragonfire, and like his ancestors from House Targaryen, Aerys II began to attempt to hatch dragon eggs. When these attempts proved futile, he became obsessed with wildfire, and it said he liked the Archmaesters Guild to store wildfire in jars shaped like fruit. By 280 AC, Aerys took great pleasure in executing criminals by burning them alive. He became so fearful of blades around him, other than those of his Kingsguard, that his hair remained uncut and became long and matted. Likewise, his fingernails grew so long and thick he had trouble even eating. He too rarely ever bathed, which made these matters worse. The king's growing paranoia only fed the other mental issues he had already possessed. Many consider Aerys to have been mad and cruel, especially to those who fought against him in Robert's Rebellion. Daenerys Targaryen, who was raised by her brother Viserys, has an idealized view of a father she never knew. The burning alive of Rickard Stark and the sadistic death of Brandon Stark did cement his reputation in the eyes of the rebels that he truly was the Mad King. It's very hard to deny that Aerys was not clearly mad by this point. I think the biggest question mark about him is his erratic behaviour prior to Duskendale, and whether it should really be counted as madness, or is this element of Aerys' personality only retroactively viewed as that after the events of Duskendale, and his downfall in Robert's Rebellion. He wasn't exactly being called the Mad King prior to that point. No matter your stance, it's very clear whatever trauma Aerys did suffer at Duskendale all but ensured his legacy as the Mad King. King Maegor wanted no rat in his own walls. If you take my meaning, he did require a means of secret egress should he ever be trapped by his enemies, but that door does not connect with any other passage. Varys the Spider to Tyrion Lannister, A Storm of Swords Chapter 12, Tyrion 2. Maegor the Cruel, the son of Aegon the Conqueror and Rhaena Targaryen, is the second clear-cut case of a Mad Targaryen, arguably the first instance we know of. While Maegor and Aerys II's madness does share some similarities and themes, in the sense that some form of trauma made their underlying issues worse, I would argue Maegor's supposed madness manifested a lot more clearly in his youth than it did with Aerys. While Aerys' madness developed over time, there is a lot more to suggest that Maegor's was always there under the surface. As a child on Dragonstone, Maegor demonstrated some alarmingly violent tendencies. There is a tale that says as a toddler he killed a cat, but some dispute the truth of this claim. But at the very least we do know that at the age of 8, he stabbed to death a pony that had kicked him, then slashed half the face off a stable boy who came to help. Maegor as a person was described as a hard and brutal man who craved violence, death, and absolute mastery over all he deemed his. His savagery in the field and his harshness towards defeated enemies was frequently noted. Maegor was quarrelsome, quick to take offence, slow to forgive, and fearsome in his wrath. He was a rigid man, unyielding. He preferred fire and steel over settling issues through discussion, and showed cruel tendencies as a result. When Maegor usurped the throne from his nephew in 41 AC, the realm was in utter chaos after the indecisive rule of King Aenys. The Faith Uprising had pushed House Targaryen to the point of its downfall, unless there was quick intervention. This is what makes Maegor the Cruel's initial usurpation of the throne difficult to judge, because while some of his actions during this time were extremely heavy-handed and brutal, such as the burning of the Scepter Remembrance and the warrior sons within, there was an argument that the situation was so dire for House Targaryen, a firm hand like this was needed to take control of the situation and restore order, and to stop House Targaryen's freefall. Now, something greatly overlooked when talking about Maegor is how his trial of 7, when he came to claim the throne in King's Landing, drastically changed him as a person. Like Aerys II at Duskendale, the trial of 7 is a before and after kind of event with Maegor. While Maegor does win his trial, he suffers a massive blow to the head and is carried from the battlefield half dead and left in a coma for days while maesters and healers try to save his life. On the 28th day of Maegor's coma, Queen Alis Haraway returned from Pentos, bringing with her Tyanna of the Tower. Tyanna took over Maegor's care. On the 30th day, since the trial, the king woke. And when he woke from his coma, his personality was drastically changed, and the worst of his extremes of his mental issues had come to the forefront. He was now more irritable, known to have random bursts of rage. He was more brutal in his punishments. Over his reign he would truly earn his name, the Cruel. Some notable instances being his mass killing of the builders of the Red Keep to preserve its secrets, and his extremely brutal forms of execution, especially when it came to the extinction of House Haraway and the torture of his wife, Alis. In fact, several of his wives shared similar fates to Alis. While there certainly was an argument that a king like Maegor was needed early in his reign to repair the damage of his brother, Aenys, Maegor certainly did enough to earn his feared reputation. While Maegor's madness centered around his violent nature, something that he shared with Aerys at his worst, he didn't seem to suffer the same sort of paranoia as the Mad King. But the key thing here is both men seemingly suffered some form of mental illness, which was drastically worsened after some sort of trauma. In Maegor's case, physical. In Aerys's, more mental. Aerion is quite the monster. He thinks he's a dragon in human form, you know. That's why he was so wroth at the puppet show. A pity he wasn't born a Fossaway. Then he'd think himself an apple, and we'd all be a deal safer. But there you are. Aerion Targaryen to Duncan the Tall, a knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the Hedge Knight. Aerion Targaryen, the second son of King Maegor Targaryen, is the third very clear case of this Targaryen madness, and we get to see flashes of it during the Dunk and Egg novellas. He's described as being cruel, arrogant, and that he thought he was a dragon in human form. Aerion was despised by his younger brother Aegon, who considered him an inveterate liar. Once, Aerion told Aegon he would geld him and turn him into a sister he could marry. However, it's unclear how serious he was, with some claiming he was merely joking, trying to scare his younger brother. Aegon also says that Aerion once killed his cat by throwing it down a well. According to Ryman Fossaway, the prince was all smiles and courtesy in front of his father, Maegor, but Aerion's true nature showed in front of others. His elder brother, Prince Aeron Targaryen, thought of his brother as quite the monster. As we see throughout the Hedge Knight, Aerion is prone to violent outbursts of rage, and his conduct on the tourney field was also much more violent than was socially expected, with Aerion intentionally killing his opponent's mount. In many ways, Aerion seems to follow the same pattern of behaviour as Maegor the Cruel during his youth. In fact, I think Aerion would have endorsed the comparison, given he would go on to name his own son Maegor. But the true testament to his madness is the idea he believed he was a dragon in human form, an issue that would only grow, with Aerion becoming more obsessed with it. In the same year of his son's birth in 232 AC, he died screaming after drinking a cup of wildfire, believing it would transform him into a dragon. This is hardly the actions of a sane man, and too mirrors Aerys' obsession with wildfire at the peak of his madness. So there's 3 Targaryens you cannot deny are certainly mad. However, what makes these men different from the other Targaryens that follow is while they did clearly suffer from a form of mental illness, from violent outbursts, to several conditions I'm not well versed enough on to define, but the likes of bipolar, schizophrenia and manic depression do spring to mind. 2 of them also suffered some form of deep physical or mental trauma that made these underlying issues much worse. Now, 3 Targaryens out of hundreds over 300 years isn't really bad odds at all. So does this idea of the gods flipping a coin to decide the sanity of a Targaryen really holding that much truth to it? Why did it become so popular of a saying? Well, it comes down to two things, defining the word madness and the context of it being used. While Maegor, Aerion and Aerys were widely accepted to be mad, there are several other Targaryens that might actually surprise you to have been labelled as such. No ruler can make a people good. Baelor the Blessed prayed and fasted and built the seven as splendid temple as any god could wish for, yet he could not put an end to war and want. Barristan Selmy to Daenerys Targaryen. The Dance with Dragons, Chapter 36, Daenerys 6. There are 3 other Targaryens that have been described as mad, but are only a fraction of the madness we have seen so far, to the point I'm not sure if it's fair to call them truly mad. King Baelor, who ruled from 161 to 171 AC, is often described as the Septon King, given his deep obsession with the faith. So much so, he locked up his sisters in the Maiden Vault, including his wife whom he renounced. Baelor wanted to preserve the innocence of his sisters from the wickedness of the world and from the lusts of men, and prevent them from tempting the men at court with carnal thoughts. But there were those who wondered whether or not Baelor feared the beauty of his sisters on his own behalf. Many protested their imprisonment, including the hand of the king, Prince Viserys, the princesses themselves, and other members at court, but Baelor would not relent. This alone was some really questionable behaviour. While some good would come of Baelor's faith, such as the building of the Great Sept and his open-handed charity to the poor, his obsession with his piety would be near deadly, as he would often fast for weeks at a time, causing him to be very ill. He would also order the burning of books he deemed an affront to the Seven, and even gave tax exemptions to lords and men who put their daughters in chastity belts to protect their innocence. But much like his care for the small folk, he was not all bad. For example, when his cousin, Princess Nerys, gave birth to twins who both died shortly after their delivery in 161 AC, the king fasted for a moon's turn. But he also sent away Nerys' lusty husband, Prince Aegon, the future King Aegon IV the Unworthy, sending him to Braavos in a diplomatic mission. Accounts from this time suggest it was an excuse to make sure Aegon left Nerys alone, so she could recover from the difficult childbirth. Baelor's faith would take his life after the collapsing during a 41-day fast, leaving behind a confusing legacy of kindness and religious oppression. Some call Baelor mad, given his extreme obsession with the faith. But some also claim this erratic behaviour all came about after he was bitten by vipers while freeing the captive Prince Aemon the Dragon Knight in Dawn, with the poison being the cause of his so-called madness. The issue is, while Baelor's behaviour did become more extreme after the viper bite, he was still very pious and religiously motivated prior to it, which suggests if we want to call Baelor's faith a form of madness, the underlying issues were always present in a lesser form. Prince Rhaegal Targaryen is another openly stated Mad Targaryen. However, his case is much less clean-cut as the others up to this point, with his so-called madness effectively harmless. He was the third son of King Daeron II, and briefly his elder brother King Aerys I's heir. Rhaegal was considered a sweet and gentle man, but touched by madness. He was furthermore said to be meek, sickly, and feeble-minded, to the point that some in the realm believed him as good as dead, given his level of ineptitude. During the reigns of both his father, King Daeron, and his brother, King Aerys I, his condition was well known in the realm, and rumours claimed he danced around the Red Keep naked. According to his nephew, Prince Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegal was loved by his younger brother, Prince Maegor. He died in 215 AC while choking on a lamprey pie. The implication with Rhaegal is, while he was quite simple-minded and maybe not exactly the sharpest of minds, but other than the dancing through the Red Keep naked, we don't really have much to point at true madness on the scale we have seen so far. Yet he is included on the small list of openly mad Targaryens, where he seems relatively harmless in contrast. Though blood and cheese had spared her life, Queen Helaena cannot be said to have survived that fateful dusk. The writings of Archmaester Galdane on blood and cheese, fire and blood, the dying of the dragons, a son for a son. Helaena Targaryen is a very different case of so-called madness, given the circumstances of it seem very different to any of her kin we've talked about thus far, which does highlight the question as to if there really is any legitimacy to this idea of Targaryen madness being this genetic issue which came as a result of generations of sibling and close kin marriages. Helaena for most of her documented life was described as having been a pleasant and happy girl, with all agreeing she would be an excellent mother one day, which in truth she seemingly was. She was also said to have loved her dragon Dreamfire. Taking to the skies on her was Helena's greatest joy in life, other than her children. She was also very well liked by the nobility and small folk alike. Even after she became queen at the start of the Dance of the Dragons, Helaena was loved by the small folk and even some of her foes on the other side of the Civil War. For the most part, to this point in her life, she had been a happy, normal person, showing no signs of any mental issues. But all of that would change following the murder of her eldest son, Jaehaerys, during the infamous blood and cheese incident at the start of the Dance of the Dragons. It is said Helaena became depressed and descended into madness. She refused to eat, bathe, or leave her chamber. Nor would she look at her younger son, Maelor, knowing that she had chosen him to die before blood and cheese's bluff. She became unreliable as a dragon rider, incapable of flying into battle. When King's Landing fell to Rhaenyra in early 130 AC, Helaena was taken captive. After the death of Helena's second son, Maelor, at Bitterbridge, his head was sent to Queen Rhaenyra in King's Landing. Several days after the Battle of the God's Eye, Helaena jumped from the window of her room in Maegor's Holdfast. She died immediately on the spikes below, with her throat impaled, only 21 years of age. At the moment of Helena's death, her dragon Dreamfire is said to have suddenly roused and snapped 2 of her chains, and roared loud enough to shake the dragon pit. The reason Helaena committed suicide after half a year of captivity remains the subject of speculation, and depends on what version of events you want to believe. The most likely version, given the context of the situation, is the version in which Lady Mysaria, Rhaenyra's spy master, had chosen that night to tell Helaena the death of her son Maelor and the horrific manner of it. There is even strong evidence that suggests that Helaena may have actually been assassinated rather than jumping herself. But like a lot of these diverging events from the Dance of the Dragons, in truth we have no way of knowing what truly happened. The key thing we learn with Helaena is that she seemed to be a normal, happy and healthy woman, with the loss of her sons causing her madness. Grief and loss of a child is a very difficult thing for any parent to deal with, especially with the manner of both Jaehaerys and Maelor's death. Thus, even if she did indeed descend into madness, I'm not sure you can really blame her, being a Targaryen, for it. I think even the most mentally strong woman would struggle with this kind of loss and pain Helaena had to endure. And this is where we get to one of the key points of this video, where we have to discuss the term madness and what it really means, because the context of the setting in our modern real-world point of view really matters. In a medieval, or in this case pseudo-medieval setting, madness is a catch-all term for any and all forms of mental illness, from personality disorders, depression, erratic behaviour. It encompasses it all, and is a term for anyone whom isn't acting socially normal. The modern concept of madness is greatly different, as we have a much better understanding of mental health and how to manage and deal with these types of issues. But when we are looking at the concept of madness through a more general lens, there are a few Targaryens whom, while they are not described as mad in history, could be argued fit this definition. As a result, these Targaryens are overlooked when talking about the idea of madness being a 50-50 genetic thing. Aelora Targaryen is an interesting case. She's one of the twin children of Rhaegal Targaryen, who we've already discussed, with many suspecting she may have inherited some of her father's mental issues. For the most part, however, it seems she lived a very normal life, with very little of it noteworthy enough to mention in history books. She's mostly known for her fate, which in turn is where this idea she was apparently mad comes from. In 217 AC, Aelora accidentally caused her twin brother Aelor's death in a grotesque mishap which left her mad with grief, details of which are not known. Following Aelor's death, King Aerys recognized Aelora as his new heir to the throne, but sometime later, 3 men we only know as the Rat, the Hawk and the Pig attacked Aelora at a masked ball, after which she committed suicide. It's really hard to judge Aelora's madness given how little we know about her, but again we have a seemingly normal person developing these issues after some trauma. Despite her father's madness, it's impossible to say if it relates to her own fate. Gael Targaryen was the youngest of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne's many children. Given that Alysanne's last two babes died, you could argue Gael was very much overprotected by her mother out of fear she might meet the same fate, to the point she would often be found sleeping in her mother's bed. In 99 AC, Gael suddenly disappeared from court. It was announced later she had died of a summer fever. After the deaths of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne, it was revealed that Gael had been seduced and impregnated by a travelling singer. She had given birth to a stillborn son, and overwhelmed by her grief, had walked into Blackwater Bay and drowned. Some fans argue that Gael constitutes another Mad Targaryen, while others that her social development issues had nothing to do with any idea of Targaryen madness. What we do see is a theme with Gael's fate is there's certainly a correlation between trauma and loss and some form of mental decline, especially when it comes to Targaryens who took their own lives. In a similar vein, I've seen some fans read Rhaena Targaryen, King Aenys' eldest daughter and Jaehaerys' eldest sister, as suffering from some form of mental illness, at least later in life. From a very young age, Rhaena was a withdrawn person with a very small select group of friends. Over her life, the death of her husband, Aegon the Uncrowned, in the battle beneath the God's Eye, to being forced to marry Maegor the Cruel, betrayal by close friends she held dear, and the tragic and horrific deaths of her twin daughters, all resulted in Rhaena becoming angry and arguably a bitter person in her final years, isolating herself from the world at Harrenhal. I can definitely understand why some fans might read her character in this way, and while it is true she did suffer a great deal of trauma with it impacting her adult life, given all the evidence we do have, there is nothing that you can point to directly to say she suffered from any form of madness, the same way you could argue for Gael or Aelora. Targaryen madness is a really deep topic we've only just scratched the surface of, and very important given how big of a role it could come to play in the Winds of Winter if the ending of the TV show is anything to go by. From our point of view as a reader, with our current real-world interpretation of madness and mental health, it is in fact hard to argue many of these Targaryens are truly mad. But when you take a look at the more broad definition of the word used in George R. R. Martin's writing, well over 100, maybe even more, named Targaryens. There are only 6 that are conclusively named as mad, with only 3 of these displaying any form of madness prior to some huge traumatic event. We then have 3 more Targaryens you could make a case for being possibly mad. So out of the many Targaryens to have lived since Aegon's conquest, nearly 300 years of history, only 9 were mad to some degree that we know about. And remember, this is only named Targaryens, and not including kin such as the Velaryons or any cousins such as say Aemma Arryn. When you consider the close ties between House Targaryen and House Velaryon via several marriages, we don't exactly hear anything about dozens of mad Velaryons or half the Velaryons being mad, even though they share a huge amount of their genetics with House Targaryen. So this idea of the gods flipping a coin to decide if a Targaryen will be mad is very much hyperbole. It's an exaggeration, fueled by what I believe is recency bias. I think 2 things are at play here. When you look back at history, those big name cases like Maegor, Aerion, Baelor, Aerys are all going to jump out, given 3 of these 4 were kings. It makes the issue seem a lot larger as a result. As I mentioned, we also have the possibility of there being recency bias when it comes to the idea, especially given the story is set in the shadow of the Mad King's reign, in the Baratheon Lannister-controlled Westeros, with there still being a lot of anti-Targaryen sentiment. It makes sense how this madness narrative has taken hold, because it's politically convenient for it to do so. Here is my argument. There does seem to be quite a lot of mad Targaryens who suffer from a variety of personality disorders and mental illnesses, which could have a genetic link to it. But in terms of true madness, there is enough evidence to suggest some level of trauma has exacerbated those underlying issues and created the infamous Mad Targaryens. But most of all, I think there's 3 you cannot deny were truly mad to some degree. The Mad King Aerys II, Maegor the Cruel, and Aerion Brightflame.